Hi everyone, welcome to another Hatton's Model Railways live stream session, and today we're looking at a little bit of 1980s and 1990s railway history with the introduction of the Railfreight train load sectors, the different markings and what they mean when looking at different locomotives in the fleet. It was an exciting time for the UK freight industry on the railways with a real brand change and lots of new identities and operations coming into force. It can get a little bit confusing too, so I thought I'd prepare a handy little guide for you to show you the 6 different sectors that were created, why they were created, what locomotives you'd see in them and whereabouts in the UK and what wagons they'd be pulling to. So if you've got any particular questions at all, please do add them in the chat. I would be more than happy to answer any questions regarding the sectors you have there today. Otherwise, let's get going. So we're looking at the UK railway scene in the early 1980s. Railfreight itself was introduced in 1982, with many locomotives being painted out of the standard BR blue into the familiar Railfreight grey colour scheme. But Railfreight was a little different in the early 1980s. It had started to change, whereas a lot of trains coming into that time period were mixed goods services, similar to how they were in steam days. More and more freight was being transferred over to what we know as block freight workings. So these are trains where it has a single load in it with many wagons, often of the same type in there, rather than having trains that will split and divide down its journey. The majority of freight traffic was for one sole purpose, either transferring one commodity from one site to another. And this started to break down the fleets to a specific locomotives intended for specific workings. You had heavy, powerful locomotives such as the Class 60 and the Class 56 coming through that could handle the heavier trains at slower speeds. You had more mixed traffic locomotives such as the Class 37, which didn't quite have the same power, but they could get to more places and they were faster too. And the locomotives really did become more specified for the certain jobs that they were working on. So in 1987, the sectors were invented. There were 6 in total that they started off with that you can see on the screen here now. This came with a different branding that you see, and on the locomotives I've got here in front of me in model form, you'll see that this was installed with a brand new triple grey livery with the light grey body sides, the medium grey upper body sides and the dark grey roof, giving rise to that name. The way you told your locomotives apart was the different brands or the sector emblems on the side, and I've just given you a preview of those on the screen. These were applied to the majority of locomotives expected to haul freight traffic across the UK from the late 1980s onwards. This carried on into the 1990s too, and indeed some of the locomotives still carried these emblems into the 21st century, but they are very far and few between to see out there now. This wasn't the only thing that happened at the time, though. It wasn't just the locomotives. £8 million was spent on depot and staff facilities too. This was a real drive to increase and improve the image of rail freight industry in the UK, which was being targeted more and more by road-based traffic. So this was designed by Roundel Design Incorporated, who did the full corporate image that you see here on these locomotives and invented the different sector diagrams too. So we'll be covering all 6. I'll give you a quick overview of the different sites on there. So let's get started. Let's pick one to start with there. And I think we should start, let's start with Railfreight Coal. So this was by far the busiest of the sectors and the biggest of the sectors when it came to the fleet size, the staff size and the traffic it had. So the black and yellow emblem you see on the side of the Class 60 locomotive here signifies that this was a Railfreight Coal locomotive. As I'm sure you've already guessed by the name there, this was for transporting coal around the country, mainly on what's known as merry-go-round services from the coal mines to the power stations or from ports to the power stations throughout the UK in the late 1980s. There was also some domestic coal traffic too, using the HEA hopper wagons that travelled across the country. These then deposited the coal at local domestic coal depots for use by households or other small industries. So this was by far the biggest sector, mainly using larger, heavier locomotives that could handle those really heavy coal trains with the HAA merry-go-round hoppers. We started with a lot of the Class 56s here, and we saw a transfer to some of the heavyweight Class 37s, and upon their introduction, the Class 60s in the late 1980s too. There was a little bit of an offshoot to rail freight coal, and a small fleet of Class 31 locomotives were also put into the rail freight coal area to handle the nuclear waste traffic from the nuclear power stations in the UK too. So you could see a small fleet of those working with the nuclear flask wagons out there across the UK. But these rail freight coal locomotives did hang around where the coal mines were and the power stations were too. So South Wales, certainly the northwest and the northeast of England, you could always see quite a few of the rail freight locomotives out there along the fleet. So heading over to our next one, and I suppose we should go for the second biggest sector really, shouldn't we? We should head over to rail freight construction, which is the blue and yellow sector you can see at the top there. And rail freight construction, as I mentioned, was the second biggest sector of the six. Now, this was a lot of raw materials for the construction industry, so you can imagine how widespread that can be out there. So a lot of this material did come from quarries within the UK. So we're looking at things like limestone from the Peak District. You've got a lot of traffic coming from the Mendip Hills there too. You've got other duties there. And this was the livery that was designated for these locomotives with the familiar triple grey colour scheme, but this time with the construction emblem on there. Other duties there were sand and granite and a number of other items, maybe not raw materials, but certainly items also used in the construction industry too. We had cement there, and we had bricks and gypsum and other items that you would use in the construction industry. Again, rail freight construction had its own little offshoot from this. It also handled household waste traffic too. So even if you're building a house, if you're taking items away from a house afterwards, or local, shall we say, domestic waste, the rail freight construction sector did handle this. And as you can see on my desk here, a wide variety of locomotives were picked for these tasks. Based on the parts of England that they ran in, you could see big and small locomotives in the rail freight construction colour scheme. I've got the Class 33s from Helgen here, and then on the screen we had the Class 56, so showing the little and large locomotives that you could pick. You'd also find locomotives from classes 31, 37, 47. I believe there was a small fleet of Class 60s too in the rail freight construction colour scheme designated to those duties. So they would indeed be out there across the network. Chelmsford Junction, you'll see the English China clay trains in a little while. We'll be coming to the locomotives that hauled those shortly. But next up, let's have a look at our third sector, and let's head over to that sector for you, Chelmsford. I think I've chosen it and put it in order there. The distribution sector, as you can see here. This, in the start of its career, was the sector that handled a lot of the container traffic out there and the intermodal Freightliner traffic that you can see. Some of this remained with the Freightliner branding at the time, but this was handling those different duties too. So when it was initially set up, it was mainly for this particular purpose. We'll come back to distribution though in a little second, as we have to take a little head over for one more there. And I believe one of you already have asked about this locomotive in the chat. It's the least used and little known of the sectors. Down in the bottom left there, our fourth sector is Rail Freight General. And the locomotive we've already been asked about here is 5149, one of the few locomotives to actually be painted in this livery. This was quite an uncommon one to see. And when it was invented in 1987, this was pretty much anything that didn't quite fit, really, within the other sectors that we have. So there was some items in there, such as the China clay workings that were mentioned previously, and also the Speedlink operation too, which was British Rail's, shall we say, the pickup goods variation of the diesel era. So lots of different freight vehicles coming into one service and then splitting off at their destinations, more like a traditional goods train out there. It was quickly realised that rail freight general wasn't that big a sector, and nor was rail freight distribution. So they were merged in 1989. So we actually went down to 5 sectors rather than the 6. And then we emerged just with the rail freight distribution sector that we can see here with the red and yellow logo on the side of this Class 47 locomotive. So then everything from general and distribution that I have just mentioned, including the speedlink traffic, the container traffic, and the intermodal traffic too, did come under rail freight distribution from 1989. So you wouldn't have seen that many locomotives out there in the general livery as per 5149 that we looked at previously. But then heading over to rail freight distribution, you'd see locomotives such as some Class 37s on the China Clay workings, and a lot of locomotives expected to haul those intermodal and container duties such as Class 47s and the Class 86 electric locomotives too. And indeed, one of the brand new Class 90 locomotives introduced in the late 1980s, a lot of these were allocated to the distribution sector too. And you can see this double O gauge model here that I have in front of me carrying the rail freight distribution markings on the front. So we're almost getting to the end of our tale now, but we've still got 2 important sectors to look at. And the next sector we're going to look at there is the rail freight metals sector. And again, quite an obvious name. We're probably getting a real idea of what this sector carried. You can see it there by the chevrons, the yellow and blue chevrons on the side of this Class 37 locomotive. And this was mainly transporting steel and the components needed to make steel around the UK. So heading to a lot of the big steel works at the time up in the northeast of England, the Scottish lowlands too, and of course in South Yorkshire at this time, where the steel industry was in the 1980s. So these locomotives handled those duties. They also handled a small amount of the traffic for the raw materials required for making steel. So you had the iron ore traffic and some coal traffic, but not a lot of coal traffic was operated by the rail freight metals sector too, but it was mainly transporting steel around the country. And as you can imagine, those workings really got everywhere from the various steel mills across the UK at the time, transporting that to wherever it was needed within the construction industry. Rail freight metals also handled the car traffic from various builders in the UK, such as very near the Hatton's Hub at Hale Wood in Merseyside, and various other points in the UK that were producing cars. This quickly headed under the rail freight distribution branding. So the locomotives, as we saw before, with the yellow and red branding of rail freight distribution, did very quickly pick up the automotive traffic. So you wouldn't have seen a rail freight metals loco on those duties for so long, but then you would have headed over to the different type of locos too. So last but not least, we're coming up to our last sector, and that is petroleum. Again, you can see that all 6 of these sectors have really obvious names compared to the type of traffic that they will carry. And the emblems there too on them really do stand out to give you an indication of the different vehicles. And as no doubt some of you won't be surprised, Railfreight Petroleum was for the transportation of oils, tank traffic, chemicals, petroleum, anything that you could put in a tank wagon essentially became under the duties of the petroleum sector. So these locomotives, again, were spread far and wide across the UK. You had locomotives working down in Essex at the oil refineries at Thames Haven. Heading into the northwest, you have Stanlow Oil Refinery. And then Scotland, you've got Grangemouth Oil Refinery too. This is just a small amount of the workings and refineries that the petroleum sector did serve. Also, some of the other traffic you had there was the crude oil traffic that worked mainly in South Wales, but also did cover a lot of the UK. And some of the gas tanks, the various tank wagons that transported gases or liquid gases rather than liquids, did come under the petroleum sector too. So it's essentially anything with a tank wagon on it would come under that petroleum sector. So that's a really good question there. As you can see, some of the rakes were large and small. I'll just pull that question up there from Chelmsford. And yes, large and small rakes were found between pretty much every sector, really, that you can see on the screen. While they were block freight duties, you will find that some of them had what we call feeder traffic out there. So smaller rakes of steel trains or petroleum traffic out there running to form larger services in the UK. So have a look at some of the prototype information out there. Also, if you click the link in the description, I've got links to every single model we have available right now in the triple grey livery, dependent on the sectors. We have a lot of them out there. Some locomotives, such as the Class 08 here, that could be transferred between sectors quite often, with it being a shunting locomotives, didn't receive any markings at all. So this is purely a triple grey locomotive. But if they were going to be operated by one of the sectors for a certain period of time, they did gain one of the markings that we see on the side of the locomotives here and on the screen now. In most cases, the actual locomotives were majority owned by British Rail and Railfreight, and a lot of the wagons were, but this was the era when private wagons were starting to come into operation. Privately owned wagons were being made available by different operators and owners. And of course, we had the first private freight locomotives introduced in the mid-1980s in the form of the Class 59 too. So a lot of freight wagons these days are now privately owned by the various operators and industries that they require. And this is where it started, but a lot of vehicles were still painted in those Railfreight colour schemes. Only a small number of wagons actually did get the branding that we see here. A lot of them carried on the Railfreight red branding from the early 1980s. But you could still see these emblems on wagons, on depots, on some station areas where freight facilities were too. So do keep an eye out for them. It is surprising where they turn up, but mainly they were on the side of various different locomotives, as we can see some again on the screen, heading through Railfreight Distribution, Railfreight Coal, Railfreight Petroleum, Railfreight Construction, Railfreight General, short-lived, don't forget that one. And finally, Railfreight Metals there once again. There are your 6 sectors, and there are the operations that they did carry. As I'm sure you can imagine, this is just a small amount of the history of the Railfreight sectors. You can get a far better idea by clicking that link in the description and seeing some of the many models we have available right now in N gauge, double O gauge, and O gauge too, in this iconic colour scheme, which lasted from the late 1980s in some extent into the early 2000s, and more locomotives in preservation are being painted into this colour scheme too. I really recommend checking out the Formations bookazine on our website too. Head over to the link in the description for that. That gives some fantastic options for rakes, especially for the sector era. You can check that out. It's called Diesel and Electric Formations, and you can pick that up from us right now. And again, the link is there in the description for that particular magazine. But if you've any further questions, if you'd like to learn a little bit more, please do get in touch. Either leave a comment on the video or get in touch with our customer experience team, who would be more than happy to answer any questions that you do have on this era or any era of the UK's railway history. I hope you've learned a little bit more today on the various items that we have available, and possibly unlocked some of the secrets behind the various different rail freight sectors that are available. If you've got any questions regarding these or any other products at all that we do stock, do get in touch with our customer experience team, who would be more than happy to give you a hand. Otherwise, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.